Doc Holliday, Nurse Ratched, Darth Vader, Professor Snape, Miranda Priestley, and Annie Wilkes, the nightmare of writers everywhere, are all awesome because the writers of those stories and of those characters didn't forget to pay attention to subplots. And today, we're talking about subplots. Thank you for liking, subscribing, interacting in some way. Drop a comment. I really appreciate it. Let's jump in. Subplots are often relegated to the background of the screenwriting process, and they're often an afterthought in story creation. And while your main story has to be working on all cylinders, the best stories fold in meaningful, impactful, and sometimes gut-wrenching subplots. And subplots and subplot characters do so many things in a story that simply elevate it to a whole other level. And if you want to progress as a storyteller, you have to learn how to handle subplots. So what are subplots? Well, simply they are mini stories that revolve around supporting characters. Now, keep in mind there are a few characters involved in your story. You have a main character, there's usually only one. You have a few supporting characters, somewhere between 3 to 5 or 6, give or take. You might have several string characters and background characters. But the subplots involve the supporting characters. But you don't have to have a subplot for every supporting character. So just because you have a supporting character doesn't mean you need a subplot for them. But subplots are reserved for supporting characters. The main character has their own story. String characters don't get a story, but supporting characters can have a subplot. But as a subplot is a mini story, the same story requirements are at play. Someone who wants something badly, they're having trouble getting it, and they get it or they don't. Your villain should have a subplot. Now, usually it's in opposition to the main character, and sometimes we just think that the villain's just part of the main character's story, so why do they need their own thing? Well, because it's a story. You've got to have all the parts for it to be a functional story. So if you want your villain to have a subplot, and usually the villains have a subplot, the antagonist has a subplot, you've got to have the story pieces. Someone who wants something badly, they're having trouble getting it, usually the protagonist's fault, and they get it or they don't. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But you must have all those parts for there to be a functional subplot. Similarly, love interests, best friends, co-workers, teammates, all of them usually get a subplot. And keep in mind that more than one character can be pursuing the same goal, as long as they're doing it for different reasons. This is often the case with protagonists and antagonists, right? So they're trying to do the same thing, but for different reasons. And why you want them to have different reasons is because if something is doubled up, as an audience, we kind of feel like, hey, we've already seen that.
We're at the airport.
Yeah, so?
I already seen the airport.
And that element is usually bad in any story. So if you're familiar with the movie Aliens, both Burke and Ripley want to go to the colony. Now, Ripley wants to go because there are people there and she wants to rescue them and she wants to kill any aliens that are there. Burke wants to go to the colony, but he wants to capture an alien if they're there and bring it back so he can make some money. Same goal. They want to both get to the colony until they realize the reasons for that goal, those are not quite the same thing. And when you start talking about subplots, there's actually 3 functions for a subplot. So they kind of serve one of 3 roles. Sometimes they serve more than one at the same time. So the first function is a story function. So the subplot is revolving around a supporting character, and a supporting character helps or hinders what the main character is trying to do. Now, sometimes there are parallel stories that are going to later intersect. So I've got this subplot going on over here, this main one going over here, and they're going to intersect. Okay, so sometimes I have that happening. That might be a story reason. Or sometimes it's just the villain doing their own thing, right? The villain's doing their thing, protagonist doing their thing, and they're going to collide at some point. Maybe it's the BFF or the second in command or whoever it is trying to do something. So kind of like the Burke example, they go along when it suits them, but when it doesn't, they go a different direction. And usually it's against the protagonist. Now, all of these things help move the story along. So sometimes subplots function as a story function. Subplots can also work in a thematic function. So with the theme. Subplots are great places to explore the theme of your story. So if you have a theme, for example, of faith or belief in something, then using your subplot characters to have different perspectives on faith or belief, man, that's great. So maybe you've got one character that's about being unfaithful or unbelieving, or another that's skeptical, or another that's hesitant. All of those are helping to show your theme in different dimensions, which helps pull it out and let audiences notice it. The third way a subplot works in a story is maybe you need it for a structural or storytelling function. Subplots are often there to help shape the emotions of the audience and the emotions of the film and the audience's enjoyment of their experience watching the film. So sometimes you use a subplot and subplot moments to delay something that we're looking forward to. We're looking forward to this long-awaited battle, right? This character, they're finally going to square off, and then we get a subplot scene, right? And there's something that's really meaningful in there, like, oh, that was really good, but oh, I'm having to wait for this battle, and I want to see the battle, right? It causes us to wait, and it heightens our emotions. Maybe sometimes you have a subplot scene that just gives us some relief. Like, we had this long-awaited battle, and man, I need a breather, right? I need a chance to catch my breath. So giving me a subplot scene is a nice respite. It's like a nice little break. But usually that respite is partnered with some additional knowledge, and now we know something the main character doesn't know, and now we're worried because the main character has no idea.
But the Emperor Claudius knew that they're up to something. He knew they were busy little bees. And one night he sat down with one of them, and he looked at her, and he said, "Tell me what you've been doing, busy little bee, or I shall strike down those dearest to you. You shall watch as I bathe in their blood." And the Emperor was heartbroken. The little bee had wounded him more deeply than anyone else could ever have done.
So let me give you some tips or best practices for using subplots and kind of incorporating subplots. Before I get into that, it would really help me out. Interact in some way. There's links below that might be of interest to you. If you're finding value, like, subscribe if you haven't, all those things. If you got a question or comment, drop it below. Any of that stuff is really, really helpful. And if you want to learn more about building effective characters, I have a robust section of character building in my screenwriting fast track course. A link for that is below if you want more information. Okay, some tips and best practices for using subplots. 1, subplots are usually self-contained stories. They might need the context of everything else going on in the movie just to make full sense of it. But if we understand all the other stuff going on, we can understand the subplot. Just as reference, most films, not all, most have between 70 and 120 scenes, give or take. Now, typically about 60% of that, or like 40 to 75 scenes or so, are the main story. Okay, the rest of those, the balance of those scenes, are devoted to subplots. And those remaining 18 to 48 or so scenes are probably spread over 3 to 5 subplots. So the villain or the antagonist is going to get the most, and then others are going to get less. So if we have like 30 scenes, maybe half of those 30 are reserved for the villain, the antagonist, and the other 15 get split between maybe 3 other subplot stories. So I might get 4 or 5 scenes for each other subplot. And here's the thing, those scenes should be able to tell a story from beginning to end. So just go pick your favorite movie, doesn't matter which one, your favorite movie, one you're like, this one's good, and just count the scenes with the villain. So let me give you one example. Silence of the Lambs. Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins, is a major character, right? He won Best Actor for this movie. Okay, so important character, but he's on screen for a total of 24 minutes and 52 seconds. That's it. His subplot is help Clarice out enough that he has an opportunity to escape. That's his story. And as the story progresses, his imprisonment is less and less lax. Okay, so, or more and more lax, I should say, right? and ultimately he escapes. Sorry, spoiler, I know. The tip here is make sure each of your subplots is actually a story. Make sure the character wants something, they're having difficulty getting it, and they get it or they don't. Hannibal Lecter wants to escape. He's having trouble getting it, but he eventually gets it. That element has got to be there, and if it's not, you don't have a subplot. All you have is an interesting character and probably a caricature of that character. A second tip. A solid place to drop in subplot scenes in your story, if you don't know where to put them, are in between sequences. Now, I've talked about sequences a little bit on this channel, but I am planning to revisit them very, very soon. So if you aren't sure what sequences are, stay tuned. I did talk about them in my analysis of Black Panther, and I'll put a link to that specific video where I'm talking about sequences. I'll put that link right here. But here's the teaser for sequences. A sequence is a series of scenes centered around an individual about a specific event. Okay, so they're trying to accomplish something. So, will Clarice Starling get Hannibal Lecter to agree to help with the case? That is a sequence in Silence of the Lambs. It's a sequence. It includes this whole part of Jack Crawford asking her to go see Hannibal Lecter, her arrival, her going through her initial interview with Hannibal Lecter, and her leaving. All of that is all about, will she get him to help? Guess what scenes surround the sequence? Other subplot scenes. So subplot scenes can kind of help you stitch your story together a little bit because they're kind of mini stories and we get little chapters in between. So we're tracking with that while we're tracking with the broader story. Tip number 3 is make sure your supporting characters are interesting enough to warrant a subplot, but not too interesting. I mean, if they outshine your main character, you'll fall into the Pirates of the Caribbean curse of subplot character taking over. Okay, this is bad. And then your story just starts sprawling out of control. And before you get up in arms, because you really like Jack Sparrow, 1, he's not the main character, and 2, there is no way you can explain the length of this scene logically.
Rock.
If your subplot characters are more interesting than your main character and you're spending too much time with them, okay, you have other problems, Captain, and you need to address your main character first. Tip number 4 is make sure the goal of your supporting characters is something that matters to them. If they care about it, we will care about it. In other words, what they are pursuing has to make sense to them. They've got to know why they're doing it, and they got to have a really good reason for doing it. They might be going about it in all the wrong ways, maybe, but we understand why they are pursuing that goal.
Let's start with you.
Me?
Well, I'm Russell K. Sir. And after Nam, I got into crop dusting, and been doing that ever since. On a personal note, sir, I'd just like to add that ever since I was kidnapped by aliens 10 years ago, I've been dying for some payback, and I just want you to know that I won't let you down.
And the last tip, don't be afraid to kill them off. Killing off a supporting character before they can achieve whatever it is they're after, or their death is a way of them achieving their goal, so maybe they're sacrificing themselves.
Do me a favor. Tell my children I love them very much. All right, you alien holes. In the the words of my generation. Up yours!
This is a great way to heighten the stakes of the story. I mean, not only does a well-timed death pull the audience in even more, it pushes their protagonist to work even harder to achieve the goal. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. If it has, please be sure to like, subscribe, bell, all those things. I really appreciate it. When you go to tell a story, include subplots, because they're great to include, but you gotta do it right. So include subplots, but when you do, tell a story that matters. See you later.